I'll, so I'll be recording this session for streaming on our website and our YouTube channel. If you are speaking and you want to speak and ask a question at the end and you don't want to be on the recording, then you can, of course, just type your question in the chat, and that means you won't appear on the recording. But I'll be recording this now, and that hopefully all of our speakers will be then available for you to watch at your leisure later on. So let me just introduce the speakers. First of all, we've got Paul Booth, who's Professor of Communication. There he is, at DePaul University in Chicago. And along with Aaron Trammell, who's also a speaker today, he's the series editor of a new tabletop game series from University of Michigan Press. And I think both Aaron and Tanya and some other people who are in the room are contributing to that series with all sorts of interesting books about specific board games. So that's really exciting. And I think Paul might say a little bit about that when he's talking later on. Paul's also the author of Board Games as Media, kind of seminal work on board games that came out last year from Bloomsbury, and numerous other books on fandom and gaming. His latest work includes an extensive ethnographic study of players with in-depth interviews with game designers, which explore this issue of diversity and inclusion that we're going to be talking about today. We've got Tanya Pabuda, who's recently completed her PhD dissertation, and that looks at the relative number of women designers, people of colour, Indigenous people in the making of top-ranked board games, specifically games that represent the top-ranked 400 games on Board Game Geek. So her dissertation is a kind of quantitative visual analysis of gender and racial representation in the artwork featured in those board games themselves, but also involves a wide-ranging online survey that revealed that representation was a notable factor in perceptions of and behaviours within the hobby and industry. So Tanya's research is really intersecting around the games themselves, but also the communities and the practices that are growing up around them. Tanya's research explores the pleasures and dangers of being an embodied player in board game spaces, and she's looking at what happens when players enter board game spaces such as the friendly local game shops, meetups and conventions. And finally, we've got Aaron Trammell, who's an assistant professor of informatics and core faculty in visual studies at UC Irvine. He writes about how Dungeons and Dragons, Magic the Gathering and board games inform the lived experience of their players. And notably, he's the editor-in-chief of the journal Analog Game Studies, which really sort of founded the academic discipline of analog game studies and kind of grew a community up around that. So we're very grateful to Aaron here today as well. He's the multimedia editor of Sounding Out, and his research interests cover game studies, play theory, race, class, and gender. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to hand over to Paul. He'll speak for around 15, 20 minutes, and then Tanya will speak, then Aaron will speak, and then we'll open it up to questions. I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to mute myself, but if there's any tech problems, give me a shout and I'll come back.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen. I don't have very many slides, but I did put together just a little bit. You know, after 2 years of teaching on Zoom, you'd think I would have figured this shit out. Going to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that I encountered in my research for Board Games as Media. I don't really have like a main thesis here because I think the kind of larger discussion is going to be kind of much more rich and full of insight. But I wanted to explore what I did with Board Games as Media, how I went about doing some of the research, what I learned through that process, and then focus a little bit on some of the issues that I encountered and some of the issues that I'm still kind of working through in terms of how to understand the kind of the lack of inclusion within the board gaming and tabletop hobby. And so, of course, I've got the chat open if questions pop up as I am speaking. But if please do kind of keep questions in mind as well for later when Tanya and Aaron and I are all kind of having a conversation. So yeah, as Chloe introduced, and thank you so much, I'm a professor of media and cinema studies, which is how I approached board games in my book, Board Games as Media, which came out almost exactly a year ago, actually, which is weird because it seems both yesterday and like a decade ago in pandemic time. And what I did in Board Games as Media, I'm a gamer. I like playing board games, but I also, as an academic who studies pop culture, it is impossible for me to do things for enjoyment without also thinking about them in a kind of larger cultural sense. So as a gamer, I started thinking about how are board games and the popularity of board games today, how are they reacting to changes in culture? How are they reacting to changes in players? How are players reacting to games? So I really wanted to explore this idea of what would happen if we looked at board games as if they were media texts, as if they were films and television. And there's a long history of exploring media texts in this way. There's a long history of film studies and television studies and radio studies, and looking at meaning as it's constructed by these texts, and then how it's received by an audience. And the big difference with board games is obviously that there's this kind of co-creation that happens between the players and the game designers themselves. So a game designer can create a space to play, but the players themselves have to put themselves in it. They have to engage with it. And the actual text might change. There may be 300 cards in a game, and you only read 15 or 20 of them in a game session. So what I found in doing the research for Board Games as Media is that it's not enough just to look at the game. You also have to look at the players. You have to talk to the players, and you have to conduct ethnographic work and interviews in order to find out how people are actually engaging with the game, because the meaning of the game doesn't exist unless you are in some sort of co-creation space. So what I kind of found out, and what the kind of larger point of Board Games as Media was that I was going to, in order to understand board games, we have to revisit what are considered traditional media methodologies. And so each chapter I kind of explore, it's not just textual analysis. You have to add in kind of player analysis, which I called a ludo-textual analysis, because as an academic, I love making up words. Instead of a strict rhetorical analysis, I made up the hoity-toity name interactive potentiality, and so on and so forth. And I had to, what happens to media methodologies when you look at them, not just from the perspective of the text and the creator, but as if the text was being co-created between all of these folks. But this, of course, meant that, while I was analyzing these kind of larger media methodologies, I didn't, and this is something I only realized after the book came out, really, was I didn't stop and look at the ways research itself might have to shift in order to accomplish this. So I'm going to pop back a slide. Textual analysis uses a number of different methods in order to understand it. We read a text, we analyze aspects of it. We might do a content analysis. We might read the text and do a discourse analysis. If we're adding in players and players as co-creators into this, then that level of textual analysis isn't enough. And simply doing an ethnographic analysis isn't enough. We have to come up with new methodologies that combine both of these. And one aspect of these new methodologies has to take into account the types of people that are playing and the vast diversity of people that are playing. So these are just some statistics that I found. This is not the study I did. This is a couple of years ago, some industry statistics. But there's a huge range of players. And when we, in our research, focus in just on particular types of players, it's going to necessarily affect the type of findings that we find out, the types of findings we create. So for instance, we think of gamers as being 100%. I play games all the time. I own hundreds of games. I have all the expansions. I have a whole room in my house devoted to board games because that's what many of us are when we're gamers. But this research that was done, printninja.com, I can't vouch for Print Ninja, but argues that more than half of people that consider themselves gamers only have between 1 and 25 games. The definition of gamer, the very definition of player, needs to encompass all of the permutations. While 22% of people that consider themselves gamers spend more than $1,000 a year on games, there's still a significant portion of gamers, about that many, that spend less than 200 on games a year. And when you think about, a lot of board games in the States are $50-$60, that's 3 games. A quarter of gamers buy 3 games a year. This is not, we have to keep in mind that what we consider gamers as researchers or as game players may not be the audience that is actually playing games. And that, of course, affects how we do the research. So when I did research for Board Games as Media, the demographic research that I found out didn't shock me, except insofar as I really had hoped to get a greater survey of people. So I ended up reaching about 900 people with the survey that I put out for the game, for the book. And the way that I did that was it was almost entirely through social media. I did put up flyers in local game stores, and I had a total of 1 person fill out the survey from that. But I put up a link to the survey on social media, and then I shared that link with kind of board game luminaries. Richard Ham shared it. Rado, and then Rodney Smith shared it from Watch It Played. So I got some kind of big name game folks to share the survey around to their Twitter followers. So I did end up getting about 900 survey results, which is a pretty significant chunk of people. And what I found was, the majority of people were kind of over 20, slightly older in many ways, but there was a significant portion of folks who were in their 30s as well. So most of the people were between 30 and 50 years old. This is pretty significant. Although this is still very heavily skewed male, with 600 people or so who took the survey identifying as male, about 300 people identified as female. After the survey came out, I realized I should have put in kind of greater specificity in there in terms of, I did offer a non-binary category, but I should have put in more kind of categories in that for people who identify differently. But then, of course, the kind of ever-present race issue is that the vast majority, I think 93% of the people who took the survey identified as white. And I think this is something Tanya will talk about as well, but this kind of overwhelming percentage of white and male middle-aged folks doing this research and doing this survey meant that I was only kind of reaching this one particular type of person. And it's only kind of after the fact, as it is with any sort of book publication, that I realized, I should have done some other stuff. I should have tried to reach other populations. And one of the biggest issues is that I went entirely through Twitter and Facebook and other social media sites, which is going to have its own demographic issues. So what were some of the issues that I found out? What were some of the things that I discovered from doing research like this? There is a wide selection issue in terms of who we can, as researchers, reach out to, who we should reach out to, and ways that we can do this. I am not an ethnographic researcher by trade. It's something that I have learned how to do in my research, but when I'm sending out a survey, how do we reach inner city populations? How do we reach populations of folks who might play a lot of games, but aren't on social media, or are international and don't have access to social media? how do I get access to something like Weibo to reach a Chinese audience, which is kind of outside the realm of what I have been able to do. So especially in the age of COVID, where we've gone online and we've kind of shifted so much of our research online, who we can reach is an important category. And what we need to do as researchers is figure out ways to reach populations that don't normally get reached out to. One of the interesting things I did in my research, I talked to a lot of game designers, deliberately reaching out to a lot of designers of color, female designers, non-binary designers, to get multiple perspectives on the industry. And what I heard over and over again is that the communities that they're part of don't feel like they're included when they're doing board game research, don't feel like they're included when they read statistics about board games. One designer I talked to in particular mentioned that he was all of the people that he played games with kind of just played short gambling type games, and they considered themselves gamers, but they didn't play what we consider in our research in terms of thematic games or Euro games or kind of large scale games. You know, they played craps, but they still consider themselves gamers. So who we reach is an important aspect of our research. And that brings up, you know, interviews with Black and brown designers, interviews with other people of color, with people who are non-binary, female designers. Board game play looks different for different groups. And this is only something that I realized after I had done my research for board games as media. But what I was considering a gamer, what I was considering the type of person I was exploring with this research wasn't what a lot of people would consider themselves. So, you know, Board Games as Media Part 2 is going to have to reach out, find ways to reach out to other audiences, find ways to reach out to other players, and redefine what it means to be a gamer, and what it means to play hobby games. And this ultimately leaves us with a question, you know, what methodologies are best suited for studying board game players? Strict ethnographic methodology may not be enough in order to reach a population that gives us inclusive details about who considers themselves players. Who are taking our surveys? Who are we reaching out to interviews? If we do interviews in person at something like Gen Con, we are automatically excluding people who can't afford to go to Gen Con, who can't afford the leisure time off of work to go to a con like that. These are methodological questions that I know are not unique to board game studies, and I know are not unique to other areas of research, but are things that we need to keep in mind as this kind of nascent exploration of board game studies is really developing. And I think it's really important, sorry that this has so much text on it. These are quotes from a lot of the research. The vast majority of people that I talked to in the research, that I interviewed in the research, some of whom I'm sure are actually on this call at the moment, you know, talked about the issues of diversity, talked about inclusion in the board game industry, but there were a significant portion in red down here who, you know, didn't think that this was an important issue. And so there's a kind of political element to our research as well, in terms of how do we talk to and about issues that we as researchers consider important to an audience that may not. How do I convince the folks that would say, you know, the goal is to make money and it's not, and demographics is just bad business. How do I convince that person that to do a survey about inclusion if they're not going to take it seriously in the first place? So these are just some of the kind of issues that popped up in my research that I've kind of been thinking about and wrestling about as I've kind of gone back through and thought about board games as media, thought about some of the effects of my research. And, you know, I don't have answers. And I think, you know, part of what something like this event is really helpful for is bringing people together so we can share resources, so we can share ideas, so that, you know, the next person who writes a board games as media book, or the next person that writes a book about board games can benefit from what we all have talked about today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the chat.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that, and for that really important point about how the situational, the kind of situation of the researcher constructs the research in a particular way and creates these particular kind of angles and blind spots and directions. So that's fantastic. I'll hand over now to Tanya, who's going to talk about her ethnographic work in this area as well. I won't say too much. I'll let Tanya take over.
This is terrific. And Dr. Booth, that was a great overview of some of the challenges that I myself ran into in doing this research. And I think that's an incredibly productive conversation that we all need to have about how we research board games. I thought that was incredibly good. So my dissertation is entitled, "I Didn't See Anyone Who Looked Like Me, Gender and Racial Representation in Board Gaming." And I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you so much to Dr. Germain and Dr. Wake for inviting me. This is my contact information. I'm going to pop it up at the end of the screen as well, should you wish to see all the strange projects I'm working on my website. So one of the things that I often start these presentations with is I was going down a completely different road with my doctoral research. I was actually making AI VR chatbots that you could practice difficult conversations with. Don't even ask me why I was doing that. I got into this idea that there was this, I could see the systemic problems having worked in tech for several decades. And I could see that there were challenges with systemic racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, sexism. There was a lot of problems in workplaces. And I got really interested in figuring out how to tackle that. And went very far down a road with a different dissertation topic, actually creating these bizarre bots that would bully you and you could practice tough conversations with. And then I realized that, you know, the entire notion of empathic fallacy, you tell someone a story, you tell them a compelling story about your point of view or someone's experience, and that, you know, human empathy will reliably kick in. And I discovered that that was not true. So I abandoned this research. And at the same time, I was playing a ton of board games. My partner and I were going to friendly local game stores. We were going to meetup events. We were acquiring a lot of board games. And I was really immersed in board game media and social media and fascinated by what I was seeing happening in board gaming. And I could see a lot of analog, forgive the pun, with my experiences in tech. And, you know, of course, Dr. Booth spoke to some of those reasons why. It was a very heavily white and male and middle class dominated area. So I decided to get an answer to a question. I literally couldn't find the answer to this question. I was watching somebody, you know, discussing something on Twitter. I was watching board game channels and I couldn't find the answer to this question, which was who designs the top ranked board game geek games? So I set about with a wonderful opportunity with Dr. Trammell and Analog Game Studies to find out the answer to this question: who designs board games? And I actually did an incredibly manual process. I researched each and every designer. I went through interviews. I went to their website, their social media, and I determined the racial and gender identification of each of these designers. And here was my finding. So this is for the top 400 games of Board Game Geek. And what I found, and I'm looking for that systemic sweep again, 96% designers responsible for those top 400 games were white and they were men at 92.6%. And white women represented 2.7%, BIPOC men, and this is mostly Eric Lang, because I counted duplicates, 4.1%, and 0.5% white non-binary designers. So, and then I looked at, and I literally manually counted every single figure on the top 200 Board Game Geek ranked games and figured out, okay, I counted every item of fauna, so anything alive, anything animate, plus I looked at human representation. And what I discovered was 76.8% of the representation on these 200 cover arts, board game covers, were men or boys at 76.8%, and only 23.2% were images of women or girls. Okay. And again, that systemic sweep, even more stark, was the representation of racial identity. So Black Indigenous persons of color representation on board game cover art was only 17.5%. So diminishingly rare. And, I set aside for the purposes of scope for my dissertation, the fact that some of the representations were not positive. So I put that to one side and basically indicated that as a white researcher, I would do a separate project to, examine whether those representations were deemed positive or negative. So that's a separate project that I'm working on. And so 82.5% of the representation of those top ranked board games was white presenting, okay? And then, one other finding, my advisor actually asked, why are you counting every dragon? Why are you counting every donkey? I did that, by the way, because I wanted to look at some of the compares and contrasts. And what I discovered is the aggregate of aliens or fantastic creatures, imps, orcs, ogres, creatures that don't exist, were much more prevalent on these cover art images than human women. Okay, so you're more likely to see something that doesn't exist than a human woman or a girl on a board game cover. And so in addition to this basically quantitative research, content analysis and visual analysis, I combined it with both an online survey and some in-depth qualitative interviews as part of my research. Dr. Booth's really good point. You want to find out how this lack of representation lands with the players. Okay, so basically this was at the end of 2020. I did the same thing. I promoted it on Twitter, Board Game Geek, and Reddit. I did the most business for the survey in Board Game Geek fora, and I deliberately recruited for diversity. So I was looking to hear from players who don't often get represented in this type of research. I really worked very, very hard to promote it to specific fora on Board Game Geek to hear from voices that don't often get heard. And so the aggregate here, this is just a very top line, forgive the busy slide, 73.8% were from North America in terms of the respondents. 67.8% were in their 30s or 40s. The majority of the sample were women at 60.4%, and that includes trans women. And 25.3% were identified as men, 9.4% non-binary, 74.9% were white, and that was a disappointing result. I really worked very hard to get that number of Black, Indigenous persons of color gamers. I wanted to hear from them. I got 20.4%. Over half were identified as LGBTQ+. 78.9% were in a relationship or relationships. 81.8% completed some form of post-secondary education, and that was a really interesting thing. They were much more educated than the average population when you compare it to US and Canadian statistics in terms of population. And then 58.5% reported household incomes that were higher than $50,000 a year. So that was another interesting finding. And what I did with in the survey is I made sure that people could self-identify, because that was a problem that I identified with a lot of things that I had seen in the past. Letting people self-identify, particularly on things like gender identity, was really, really important. It created a lot more work for me at the back end, but it was very, very, very rewarding to see all of the different representation of different types of gender identity. So we could see that in this sample, I had 77 cis men, 175 cis women, breakdown of trans women, non-binary, and I was really happy to see this kind of diversity of gender representation in the sample. Thing and just calling this out, a little more than half were identified as LGBTQ+, and you've got this wonderful diversity of orientation, heterosexual, pansexual, biromantic, a really rich group of participants. And again, that top line finding of Black, Indigenous person of color, and you see that it was about 20.4%. And one of the interesting things I found really fascinating that actually made its way into my dissertation is I did a talk at the Bradley Tabletop Symposium in May of last year, and I got a tremendous amount of online pushback about the nature of my sample. 300, dedicated gamers that fed back on my survey. And what I got back was a lot of online pushback. Well, you didn't identify real, they're not real gamers. And that itself is an entire dissertation topic as pertains to, and I found that really a fascinating finding. Example had 11 years or more with the hobby, of the longevity in the hobby, and also at 70.7% board gamed at least weekly. Okay, so this diverse sample is very dedicated to board gaming, and that idea of, well, you didn't actually locate real gamers for this feedback was a really fascinating finding. So of this online sample, and I augmented it with very in-depth qualitative interviews, I wanted to find out if a lack of representation in artwork, in the labor of board game design mattered to these gamers. And at 84%, they agreed or strongly agreed that board gaming had a problem with a lack of equitable racial representation in board game artwork. And I've heard from a lot of the people who participated in the survey very rich, detailed comments about what this meant to them. As well, 83.6% felt that board gaming had a problem with a lack of equitable gender representation in board game artwork. And the stories I got as I was doing this research were really, really fascinating in terms of how that made them feel in board gaming spaces. 1 in 3 agreed or strongly agreed that they have experienced homophobic remarks while engaging in the board game hobby. And 7 in 10 said, and there was actually one quote from one of the commenters who filled out the survey in the anonymous survey, saying this is a hobby permeated by obnoxiousness, which I thought was very interesting. And that was a trope throughout some of the comments. But 7 in 10 said, yes, I've been experiencing civility in the hobby, which included things like alpha gaming, interrupted, talked over, or otherwise treated rudely. And then 1 in 3 said, we can't be bothered to talk about board gaming online because when we do, it becomes a situation where we're dealing with threats, insults, and or rude messages. And then another top line finding, 1 in 3 of the respondents said that they experienced unwelcome sexual advances while participating in the board gaming hobby. And all of that really culminates into a big finding from the interviews and from the research I conducted that many, just to Dr. Booth's great point, were not in spaces where we could talk to them because they weren't going to friendly local game stores. They weren't going to board game forums, identified as gamers because they wanted to avoid it. These mainstream events were places where they did not feel safe. And so that the kind of big upshot. I come from a tech background. I worked in very early tech in the late 80s, early 90s, and I see a lot of the same growing pains as I saw in tech in board gaming, that I had clients who would say, well, you don't really care about other populations outside of white, middle-class, educated men because no one else cares about computing. This is a preserve, the other folks, they don't really get it. We don't need to worry about those audiences because we've got our audience, and our audience has a lot of money and we'll be fine. And I actually wrote a piece for Analog Game Studies, which I think is poised to come out shortly, which talks about some of those experiences. You have one client that I worked with who embraced diversity inclusion, who survived and thrived and is now part of the Frightful Five of tech dominance on the planet. And then I had another client who refused to go down that route, and they no longer exist. And so I think the big final upshot is when you consider that 80% of the global population is Black, Indigenous, a person of color, and 20% are white, it's not a business decision that publishers are making. It is not a business decision that event organizers are making here. They are making a decision outside of the realm of audience research, good practices, growth and expansion strategies. Instead, they're making a decision to embrace a core white middle class segment that I would argue, if I had more time, is fully saturated, and they need to start getting out. So with that, I'm going to end with one last story, which is I attended a talk very recently. Dr. Rita Deverell, who's in broadcast, she's a Black journalist in Canada. And to Dr. Booth's point, sometimes the people who make these products can't see they can't imagine other audiences. And Rita Deverell talked about the idea that every time she pitched a story in a newsroom in Canada, she would be admonished, well, that doesn't appeal to Susie in Saskatchewan. And Susie in Saskatchewan is white. And so some stories never got told, she said. And that's a big problem, I think, facing board right now. And so that lack of design empathy, because you see the labor of board gaming and the representation within board gaming so skewed to a particular type of identity that certain stories don't get told, and certain identities don't feel welcome in these spaces. And with that, here's how you can contact me, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Tanya. Brilliant. Such in-depth and really rigorous research with audiences there. And that line, you're more likely to see like a fantasy creature than a woman on a board game art cover is just, yeah, it's very, very telling. Thank you so much for sharing that, Tanya. I'll hand over to Aaron now for his talk.
Apologies, everybody. I'm really bad at figuring out where the Zoom controls relocate when you do a slideshow and stuff like that. Still got a screen up that has all the things, then I can see you, and then I can show you. Anyways, I'm so happy to be here. I think this talk is going to dovetail really well with the other two talks. I am a historian, and I've been working this past year on two books that tell two sides of the same story. One of the books is called Repairing Play, and what it is it's a BIPOC-centered approach to the theory of play, which has been overwhelmingly theorized by white European theorists through the years. And so in that book, I kind of try to break down the fundamentals of that and come up with a new theory of play that centers BIPOC practice and the work of BIPOC designers, BIPOC players, etc., and understanding what that means. And a fundamental takeaway there is that play itself is not just about pleasure, but also about pain. But today I want to talk about the other book, and this is like hot off the presses. I'm so excited about this work. I've never shared it with anybody. The other book is about hobbyists, and it's about inclusivity in the hobby and hobby games over the 20th century, basically. So if Tanya and Paul did such a fantastic job summarizing where we got today, Hobbyists is a book that tells the story of how we got there. And so it really is trying to look at hobby games over the course of the 20th century. And so part of the story of hobby games is trying to think through what happened and where hobby games came from. And my theory is that hobby games come from a sort of white male subjectivity that is rooted in the North American suburbs, or at least that's the sample of histories I've looked at, is stuff from North America. Certainly there are hobby games in other places, but the story I'm looking at and the story I'm telling is that of hobby games in North America. And so my research took me way back to 1900, right? Where if you look at something like John Peterson's work, you just see stories about the Kriegspiel, and that would be where it is be assumed that hobby games come from. So I was thinking about this question of, like, in 1900, what's happening with the hobby or hobby games? And my research took me back to model trains. So this is a shot from Lionel Model Train, who still publishes Model Train's catalog from this year even. And you can see heavily on this picture itself, right? Like who is represented playing with model trains and what these model trains look like. And also I should say, because I didn't say this a second ago, we have all been saying the hobby, and this is an important thing, right, that circulates in the community. It's an important kind of form of community language, and in some ways community gatekeeping. So I think when we invoke this term, we should also be thinking about who is left out of this term, because the hobby has been a term that's been racially coded for a century. And so in, if you look at Lionel trains from the 1900s, this is sort of this sort of nostalgic view of a hobbyist back in the day. So let me tell you a little about model trains, because I just want to talk about this today. I think I'll make some connections to games today. Basically, back at the 20th century, there were a few big model train companies. Some of the model trains came from Germany. Marklin was a very famous company that made them. But at this moment, Lionel was a train company that gained some popularity because they had a specific innovation in how they made model trains. And the innovation that they had was that the model trains that they made had tracks that were one size fits all. So it was a lot easier to set up the tracks for the Lionel model trains than it was for any of the other model trains at this time. And what this meant was that places that wouldn't ordinarily sell model trains or be interested in model trains were very interested in them, because the barrier of entry on model trains and to get these model trains into the hands of consumers was a lot lower. And so at the turn of the 20th century, right, Lionel was pushing model trains to department stores. This was the fundamental place that model trains were being sold and operated, was department stores. And this was like the housing strategy, was like make these boutique trains and then sell them to like a Macy's, like a Sears, any of these big department stores, so that they could run at the holidays and the big displays where everybody was gathering around from the street to look, because it's the turn of the 20th century. And the other big thing that's happening at the time is it's very novel. People are excited about it. And so people are clustering around these electrified, dioramas, gazing in, looking at what they could have. And I think this is the story, because if you think about the rollout of electricity and where the rollout of electricity went, it tells a story about class privilege, right? Electricity isn't something that goes to every household immediately in the 20th century. No, instead, electricity is something that rolls out very slowly to wealthy areas first, and to places like department stores like Sears first, that can afford to pay for the electricity. And so these wealthy areas, stores, would then display model trains, and that is kind of the story behind model train structure. This sort of structure that's class-based and very much developed around electricity is still today when we talk about the hobby, especially as we think about sort of Civil War America, who had access to electricity, and furthermore, who had access to wealth. You have a situation where there's a lot of Black folk, right, who had just recently, within their lifetime, been liberated, and of course they don't have any money. They never got their 40 acres and a mule. This is a sort of racial context in North America where poverty is very common amongst Black folk, and not to mention other folks who aren't white, aristocracy in North America. And I think this is a big part of hobby games, right? Because the stories around the hobby and hobby trains are stories that kind of move on and get exported into the hobby games community as well. Let me tell you another story about model trains. This guy, A.C. Kalmbach. You're all probably like, who's this? I've never seen this picture. And I had never seen A.C. Kalmbach until I'd seen the street either. A tremendously important figure in understanding the sort of publishing circuit of the hobby. He's holding in his hand right there a copy of his magazine, which he founded in 1934, Model Railroader. And Model Railroader is the answer to how to build model trains. If you're wondering how all these people learned to assemble model trains, how to build their diagrammas, how work within the auspices of the hobby. Look no further than A.C. Kalmbach, because this man was responsible for popularizing model trains into what was a boom in the 1950s. So Model Railroader, his magazine, was his vehicle. He had initially just been publishing things for like churches in, I think he came from Wisconsin. So he was like in a small publishing local loop for sort of like churches in the neighborhood in the 1930s. But then he was a model train hobbyist, and he used publishing tools to start circulating this Model Railroader magazine. And this magazine slowly but surely gained popularity. And he even went on publicity tours with it. He'd go out, he'd start saying like, hey, did you know how wholesome model trains are for your family? Do you know everything you could do with model trains? And he started targeting more than just the department stores with the news of how great model trains were. So he's going across North America in the 1940s and even early 1950s, really trying to popularize model trains, running advertisements out of his own pocket on national TV, trying to popularize model trains. Not only because he profited it from sales in the magazine, but just because he was a devout hobbyist, right? Like he believed in the hobby of model trains. And so this is a big part of model train history, is understanding that this sort of like idea of model trains, tinkering with them and stuff, was actually popularized in a very deliberate way by somebody looking to sort of circulate and lend the word of the hobby. And if you want to know what's inside the Model Railroader magazine, man, is it a fun and deep dive. There is fan fiction that got written about like how to build a model train with your family and kids. So like one of my favorite stories in it was a story where it's like about dad and Jimmy convincing mom, of course, because this is not just a white phenomenon, but it's also a male phenomena. Convincing mom that model trains, and then episode 2 is Jimmy talking his friend into convincing his friend's mom it happens belong in their basement. And it's just like this melodrama about how to establish more model trains in all the households of all the friends in the neighborhood. But also really fascinating ads were eventually put in here, right? Ads to tell you how to find the other hobbyists in your area, how to find your local model train group. Ads that would be replicated in later magazines like the Avalon Hill General, which was one of the first magazines that would start to popularize model trains. And on that note, there's also a lot of linkage between the Avalon Hill General and Model Railroader and Trains magazine. So I found advertisements in these magazines, not just for the curvaceous tracks that one might buy if they order from Atlas, right? And I put this up deliberately, signaling the audience. Right, like this is a magazine for white men. It's invoking the male gaze. It's invoking things that men might find appealing in this advertisement, but also advertisements like next to this one for games like Dispatch, which was Avalon Hill's new train game, and games like Gettysburg, which is another Avalon Hill game. And so briefly, in the last I just kind of want to tour you through then some of the Avalon Hill holdings so that we can just kind of understand what happens after the hobby moves through this sort of like model railroad phase. So briefly, and this is, I looked through every cover of, using sort of Tania's methodology, I looked through every cover of Avalon Hill General to see what sort of BIPOC representation was there. And this is basically it. This is a staged picture of a limousine driver helping the man on the left give out $1,000 bills to the suckers in the crowd. And it was like a sort of advertisement that kind of invoked Trumpism in like 1964 about what it meant to play Avalon Hill games, right? Like if you played Avalon Hill, you were in on this joke. You knew that, like, of course, $1,000 bills don't exist in the United States, and the people who were crowding around to get them were in fact all suckers, and the game squander. And this was, you know, fiction of Black folks, right? Like very servile, very much trying to attend to the needs of the white population. And this is, I'd say, almost as wholesome as representation in the Avalon Hill General gets. Eventually, articles stray into this sort of really questionable white spaces. This is a game that they really started World War II, which is actually based on Nazi propaganda about trying to relocate the beginning of the World War II fiction. Decades after this, we have a litany of really concerning cover of the Avalon Hill General that glorify people like Erwin Rommel, Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general, and of course we have this wonderful of Adolf Hitler, as well as the other ran World War II. So this community, right, like had some very strong white supremacists in it, and I've confirmed through some interviews that there were, you know, like very, very clear white supremacists going through the convention space at the time as well. So they were really keying in on this sort of demographic. And I think this was at least, you know, creating a sort of microaggression. It was kind of gatekeeping a lot of people out of the hobby. All right, so skipping to the end, because we're almost out of time, I just want to kind of close, because this is where I started with, is this conversation about leisure and who has access to it. And I think if we're looking and why hobby games are so white, why the hobby has become such a white space historically, I think we really should be thinking about this question about who leisure is for and who has access to it, right? If you go back and you read your Marx, the working week, you know, was a sort of thing that was invented in order to give, you know, workers access to leisure, because that was something that the boss had taken away for a very long time. But this was not equitably distributed. And certainly when we get to thinking about hobby games, that access to leisure has really skewed across sort of like white male demographics along class lines for the better half of a century. And I think when we start getting into this conversation, it's an intersectional conversation where we need to understand not just, you know, who's represented in games, who's not represented, but how those representations intersect with one's racial and class-based, because I think that really the story of hobby games in North America is a story of who has had access to electricity, and thinking through that, I think tells this really interesting story about how white male privilege has been cultivated through these networks and propagated throughout people. Before I end, I also just want to give quick shout outs to everybody in the room because this is such an awesome group here. You know, to Paul and Tanya, of course, this has been wonderful. Chloe and Paul Wake, thank you both for inviting me and for bringing this panel together. It's been excellent, and always been an admirer of the Manchester Games Network's work. I know you've been doing it almost as long as we've been doing it at Analog Games Plays, if not longer. And then also because they're here, Evan and Emma, who also founded Analog Game Studies with me. We couldn't have done this without you, and it's so great to see you here too. So anyways, this has been a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we all have.
Thank you, Aaron, and that historical perspective and the kind of historical legacy of hobby games and the hobby gaming communities, and linking that to economic histories is really, really interesting and important. And as you say, it's as much a class issue as it is of other kinds of issues around inclusion. So three really fantastic talks. So I'm going to kick things off. We've got around half an hour if we need it for conversation, and I've got a couple of questions that I wrote while you were all talking that I'd kind of want to pose and ask you as a panel to sort of consider in turn. So my first question is really picks up on stuff that Paul's work kind of interrogates, and that's the idea that games are kinds of performances, right? They're co-productions. They're not just kind of things in boxes, right? That are products. So when we as gamers interact with those kind of performances, do you think that there's opportunity? Like, what constraints are there? What opportunities are there? What other kinds of other performances are coming into play? You know, we've got the performances that produce our social and embodied experiences. We've got the kind of social frames or the spaces that performance might be happening in. But do you think because games aren't just, say, like a movie or a book, that there's a kind of potential there for that performative aspect to do some of the work that needs doing around sort of challenging the sort of legacies of racial, gender, and other kinds of oppression that have grown up in these communities? So that's a really long, complex question, but I suppose it's just about the affordances of games themselves as collaborative, co-productive sites, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think I can maybe start this, and hopefully Tanya and Aaron can finish it. But I think it speaks to, your question speaks very much to what Aaron was just talking about, and the idea of leisure time, and the ability of folks to have hours to spend in a game is itself a class-based activity. And the types of gamers that we associate with the hobby are going to be performing that classism as they play those games. I'm reminded, your question reminds me of this moment that happened when I was a child that I don't like, suddenly flooded back into my mind, where I was playing a board game with a friend of mine, and we had an argument over, like, a question was asking you to, like, it was a silly game, and it was asking us to do something that wasn't possible. You know, lay an egg and pass go and collect $200 or something. And I was saying, well, it's not possible to do that, so you can't possibly be able to collect $200. And he's like, well, it's part of the game, is pretending that you can do that. And so even with that performance, even with performing and being part of that game, I had to accept at that moment the primacy of the text versus the primacy of the interaction I was having with my friend. And in that moment, I was an ass, and I was like, the game is taking precedence over our friendship. And I think even that then informs that social space that you're describing. But I'll shut up now and let Tanya and Aaron.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can go next. I think that Dr. Trammell raises such a great point. And by the way, his book, you were kind enough to share some advanced copies or a draft with me, Dr. Trammell, is so good, because it talks about the origin story of a lot of hobby gaming. It's an incredibly relentlessly good looking at the origin story and why things are the way they are now. And, one of the big findings of my research is exactly what Dr. Trammell talked about, which is access to leisure. And just a really quick aside, one of the reasons I was really interested in this research is I was, just before I decided to go back to school, was working at a nonprofit in youth mental health. I was doing a contract, I'm a project manager, and I went to a police carding event, which is basically the absolutely reprehensible, unethical, and illegal practice of stopping and carding Black youth in the city of Toronto. And one of the stories that came out of that event, just to the point about leisure, is Black youth leaders were talking about the fact that they used to play dominoes outside of their apartment building in the summer. And neighborhood associations, white-dominated neighborhood associations, complained so loud and long about the fact that these youth were playing dominoes in a public park, that the city of Toronto, or city of Scarborough, just outside of Toronto, removed the picnic tables so they could not gather. And so there are some serious issues in terms of access to leisure. Statistically, women, those who identify as women, don't have the same access to leisure time. BIPOC identities do not work more hours statistically than white, certainly middle class identities do not have the disposable income necessarily to spend as much time on these leisure activities, because they are working so much more on average. And so access to play, access to gaming is just, from a systemic perspective, not possible. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this incredible inequality in terms of the origin story of a lot of hobby gaming. A lot of people can't see themselves in hobby gaming, and there's really good, strong forces playing to make sure that it by structurally constructed will not allow those identities in, because of those white supremacist origin stories of this of gaming. And so, yeah, I think that is a huge factor, that a lot of the qualitative interviews and surveys that I did, people came back and said, like, I myself was a single mom living in low income housing for years and years. I had to stop gaming, right? And a lot of the stories that I got from the participants of my research said the same thing. Can't do it, right? Because I just don't have the access to leisure.
I think that just to bring together what you're saying and back to the question, I suppose my provocation is that games invite, they're that this co-productive space, they're around collaboration, around social performance. It should be a space where you can negotiate stuff, right? Negotiate and perhaps produce new sorts of relationships and allow space for different identities in. But actually what you're all describing is the existing frames, some of which are highly like policed in terms of like literally taking space away from people so they can't play a game they were already enjoying, or that are deeply kind of fundamentally economically literally can't afford to take the time out to do the work. That there are so many kind of, as you say, Tanya, structural frames around games as a co-creative space that are preventing access. So yeah, that's really fascinating to hear. And I'll hand over to Aaron as well and see if you want to chip in.
Yeah, so I think building on what everybody's talking about here, I did a brief conversation or so with folks at Gen Con, which is in North America is the largest analog gaming convention. And we were talking in this about how to make Gen Con more inclusive. This was the explicit conversation we were having. I volunteered some of my time to them because I was interested in the topic, and they're, as a Black man who researches these things, they were a little interested in my perspective. And what I pointed out was that one of the really awkward parts of Gen Con is that it's this like predominantly white convention that's in the middle of Indianapolis, which is a very Black city, and yet you're not seeing the community participate in the convention itself. And why is that, right? Well, think about how much code switching anybody from the community would have to do to get into that convention space, right? Like the amount of whiteness that would need to be performed by anybody who wanted to attend that convention is a whole like skill set in and of itself. These are people who aren't used to talking gamer, who aren't used to understanding the rules, yet alone language of board games or hobby gaming in any way, shape, or form. And I think that as we think about what's happening in sort of hobby game space, really recognizing that it is its own language, and performing hobby games is something that is akin in some ways to performing whiteness, is a big part of how hobby games have become something that also do some gatekeeping. So I think that's
so interesting that you're
core performances to that. Yeah.
Sorry, Aaron. It's just so interesting how you're saying my internet's a bit. I thought you'd finished. My internet's a bit behind. That you're saying playing the performance of a game is also the performance of whiteness, and that's a lot due to the communities that have grown up, but also the games themselves, right? And the kind of tropes that they like. And I was at another event over the summer. I think it might have been Generation Analog again, where you had people of color talking about themselves kind of performing a sort of whiteness in those spaces, like feeling sort of obliged to, like, not perform in the way that they performed in other spaces. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. So I want to hand over, there's a question that Evan has posed. Evan, if you want to come on the camera and say hi and pose your question in person, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I enjoyed seeing the talks and sort of collision between all three of these research projects, and I'm now interested in sort of the performance of neoliberalism between the game, the play, and the play culture, right? Specifically, how do we isolate people as individuals, see them as economic units, and then they perform. And of course, this is absolutely a white supremacist born idea. It has its roots in eugenics and others, but you know, I grew up in the 80s and in the 90s, where also this ideology was what we breathed. And is this a long-term impact of that as well, in addition to these, you know, other historical events? I'm just, for me, I'm processing the 80s, I guess, is the more specific question, and that is it's just an open, common question for everybody.
Yeah, you know what? I completely agree with that assessment. I'm just going to leap in here. I also grew up in the 80s and 90s. And one of the interesting things that, yeah, that's exactly right, Thatcher and Reagan. And, you know, the big thing here, and I've actually made a deliberate, I've created a deliberate strategy with the research. The way that I'm approaching it in certain corners is a very neoliberal, very economic, we are economic units, meant to be our wealth is meant to be extracted by companies, because that's where I was steeped in from a corporate perspective. One of the reasons I do that is it's a rhetorical strategy to help affect change in the hobby. And I actually pivoted from a different approach, which was we should care about people. And I realized that people can't, that is not resonant with most people, because of exactly, Dr. Turner, what you're talking about. That does not resonate with most people, certainly in North America, that I encounter, because their wool immediately goes up. They don't, and you know, I did a lot of research into empathy, you know, and I realized that ideological, that deep-seated ideological perspective that we are economic units is so ingrained that I can't tell a story about someone suffering and have it resonate. Instead, now I have to pivot with this research and say, hey, publishers, you know, from a neoliberal, you know, a hard charger corporate raider perspective, your business model makes no sense. It makes no sense. And you are actually going to destroy your own sector with this blinkered white supremacist, male-dominated, masculine approached, hard charging business, which is of course encoded, you know, meaning it's white, it's male, you're performing it. If to fit in, you're going to have to, you know, behave this way, and that's, you know, that's just unfortunately the world we live in. But it's a great point you're raising.
Would you say, just a provocation before the other panelists jump in as well, because Evan's asking about the relationship between gaming communities and game design and games themselves, would you say that a lot of the games that we're playing are carriers of that neoliberal individualist ideology, like, you know, competition, conflict, you know, that kind of Hobbesian survival of the fittest, you know, that kind of like you're an individual and you're not made up by your relations to other things and people. The natural world is a resource on which you can just infinitely extract and manage as a human person. So yeah, I wonder like how the games themselves actually sort of like are encoded with that kind of ideology too.
4,000%, just to leap in. I used to work in video games way back in the 90s. And that I worked in the corners, the rooms where these games were made. And I can tell you, you know, like Dark Souls or Bloodborne, the actual conversations among the developers were, let's screw this user. let's frustrate them. Let's make them feel dumb, right? I've worked in AI where I listen to those same conversations where it's like, let's mess them up. And the thing that is really interesting to me, Dr. Germain, to your exact point, is a lot of games are constructed to be rather onerous, very ableist view about what a game is. You know, a Twilight Imperium being the most extreme example is, you know, can you keep that like spreadsheet in your head? Do you have the 10 hours or 9 hours or 8 hours to spend? I've done it. It's hard. And that excludes. Right, the games themselves exclude that zero sum, right? That scorched earth approach to other people is encoded in those games, 100%.
Yeah, and then the kind of scorn that gets poured on like easy games by the community as well. Yeah, thank you, Tanya.
I love what Evan just wrote in chat, the table space that children can't reach. I have
board games right now, actually. It is a very serious issue with children.
I have a board game wall, and when my nephews came to visit over the summer, I was like, these games aren't for you, which feels really bad to say. I wanted to talk about the fanzine circuit. This is a copy of Alarms and Excursions, which was a very early Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, the first Dungeons and Dragons fanzine still running today. Lee Gold, who publishes this fanzine, has warned me as recently as last month that the people publishing this were not her subscribers, they were contributors. And I say this because within this sort of fan culture, there's also a really, really large tradition of seeing things as kind of semi-commercial, right? Like we're all putting our money in because this is for the collective good. This is for the sort of collective betterment of the hobby, right? Which comes with all of these sort of white-coated things that I discussed earlier, but also some really special things that I think are really precious and kind of precariously poised at the moment because of the Kickstarter boom, where, you know, that sort of collective space could kind of carve out some autonomy. They could publish whatever they want. They could have conversations amongst friends that were really true and earnest and meaningful, where, you know, you can see that folks growing as they like think through like what it means to be trans or how to engage with sexuality and stuff like that. And so, you know, although I think there's a lot of good cause for skepticism, I do think that the sort of hobbyists overall have found ways to carve away from the neoliberal space and into a more collectivist vision of community, even if it gets articulated in some really toxic ways sometimes.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. As a LARPer and someone who writes about the LARP community, I know Evan is too, that that's a purely non-commercial space most of the time. Although not saying it doesn't get touched by neoliberal ideologies and all sorts of other toxic things. Like that collaborative approach economically to the hobby is really different to other kinds of game spaces, I think. Paula, did you want to come in on Evan's point about this kind of neoliberal culture of games?
Yeah, and you know, I think just to kind of bring it back to that sense of individualism and the centrality of the market, at least in my research, whenever we talked about diversity and inclusion in the hobby, the number one reason why it wasn't important was because it was an economic non-starter. If the industry needed to diversify, then we would see more diversity because the market will lead. And I think neoliberalism is kind of, as you were saying, it's just this shroud that allows people to cover up white supremacist beliefs, and that in a way that makes it palatable, certainly for children of the 80s and 90s, right? And it's the major, to me, it's the major issue that we're facing in the industry, and in research about it.
Sorry, I was just in the chat. I can see that Paul's got his hand up. Hey, there he is.
Thank you. I speak from my in front of my book, My Wall of Games, which makes me feel hugely self-conscious given the conversation we're having. I'm really fascinating talk. Thank you everyone so much. And I've been hearing the word hobby games a lot throughout this from all three of you. And I was thinking back to Paul Booth's discussion of his own work and the bits of it that aren't in there, so the community might have engaged if it was a different book, which I think is a very generous way of reading your own work, to think about the book it might have been or the book it might come next. I just wondered to what extent the communities you're describing and that we encounter would change if we or if you introduced, change our understanding of what a gamer is, what constitutes a game. So hobby games are very specific, and as Tanya said very eloquently, they're very expensive. We're talking about physical, you've talked about this before, Paul, about the amount of space you need if you want to play Gloomhaven, let alone the money to buy it, and the time. So Tanya talks about leisure. And then I'm thinking about dominoes and people who might not describe themselves as gamers. And I'm thinking about mobile phone games that bring in huge numbers of women, say, into who we understand play video games. What would happen, do you think, to these communities that you've identified if we shifted slightly our understanding of what we're looking at and what games we're talking about. And that's not to say that hobby gaming doesn't need to be less horrific in its kind of communities or less excluding, but I wonder whether bringing in other forms of game, dice games, domino games, card games, might shift the way we describe gamers and players. That's I don't know. It's just what I've been wondering.
I mean, yeah, I 100% agree. You know, when I talked to folks in the interviews I did for Board Games as Media, the people that I talked to that didn't consider themselves gamers still played games, and they still thought of games as a hobby that they were very interested in. I think it speaks to a lot of what Aaron is talking about in terms of hobbyists, and the lineage of where hobby games came from, where hobbyists come from, and the links to upper class white male threads that determined that. And if you can't see yourself within that lineage, why would you identify yourself with that particular kind of culture? I mean, it does bring up a question that I've got in my own research, which is how much does a researcher need to shape the community that they're studying? And in what ways does my studying a community define it? And in what ways does the community define itself? And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. It's a perennial issue. But to me, that's kind of the core at what this issue is.
Tanya, do you mind if I jump in? So yeah, I actually, surprisingly, I might disagree a little, Paul. I think that part of the point of how white supremacy is operating here is that it is coalescing around what I call networks of privilege, which are these sort of groups of white men who are sharing power and prestige and skill shares amongst each other. And I'm not sure that's coincidental. So I think that part of the reason hobby games have become a network that's kind of successful today is because these networks of privilege have historically formed around them and historically been able to form around them. And that is that inclusivity, right? Like if we start looking at games as a broader thing, talking about non-hobby games, yeah, sure, we could include more people in that discussion, but they won't be included in those networks of privilege where these skills are being shared, where these tools are being shared. For example, I went to a Friday Night Magic event last Friday for the first time since the pandemic started. And just listening in on the conversations around me, how people were talking about the area, how people were talking about their jobs. Like I met someone who worked as a defense contractor for Space Force, just playing Magic. And right, like, and that's a sort of network of privilege, right? Like everything that he knows about IT, everything that he knows about his job is being shared with me now because I'm in that space, that very white coated space. And I think that that's a really important part of the story here.
Yeah, just to kind of jump in as well, I think the question about that Paul made earlier about you construct the research part, the communities you're researching partly through the research that you do, and then Paul Wake here kind of saying, well, if you include other communities that haven't been typically construed as part of the hobby gaming community, does that shift and change the kinds of inclusive practice we might consider? I wonder if we might consider as researchers like co-production research techniques where instead of kind of doing questionnaires on and with communities, you're actually bringing them into the research to define the terms, to define the objects of the research and define the outcomes, and not and I mean there's still loads of precarious like power plays in co-production. It's not like a magic bullet to solve the problems that Paul's talk identified, but I wonder if if as researchers we use co-production techniques, we might find we constructed those communities differently, or like we had found different research questions to ask. I'm a novice at co-production. I'm just trying to get my head around it now for a project that we're working on, but I do think it's really a generative way of doing research, maybe.
I couldn't agree with that more. I use participant action research, where basically when I'm working with respondents, they guide, and that, I think that just on that point, there's so much to talk about there, but the way that a lot of the people I interviewed define gaming is exactly that, much more expansive frame, right? And the largest tabletop board gaming site in the world is chess.com, right? So I'm really trying hard to get out of that sort of blinkered framework of what is defined as, tabletop gaming, right?
Thank you so much, Tanya. I think can't see any more questions in the chat, and we're coming up to past. So what I will do is I'll wrap up the talk there, and I'll stop our recording.